The King's Evil. During his life, Richard had some bad health. He was afflicted in his legs with scapholia, known as the King's Evil. We would call this TB or tuberculosis today. Normally in the neck lows, if it spreads to the legs, it's called scapholia. Sorry, can't pronounce doctor stuff. So it is very likely he had bluish red nodules, ulcers or sores on the skin. Unfortunately, there was no medical cure at the time, but it was believed that the touch of the king or queen could cure. Hence it was called the King's Evil. The last royal healer in England to perform the miracle cure was Queen Anne, who touched 200 victims in 1712. Unfortunately, she died in 1714, so that didn't work out too good for her, did it? Here we are in Harlequin Lane, standing outside of Springhead Farm. The census shows that at the time Springhead Farm wasn't very big, consisting of approximately 36 perches. That's an old measuring system equal to about 809.37 square metres. I only know that because I checked on Google. That's less than an acre. Basically, not very big. Though the farm itself does seem quite small, the Pratt family worked on lots of fields around the farm, possibly extending down the valley, down to what is now Harecombe Estate. We can see that the old farmhouse still stands at the end of this drive, the garden abruptly ending on this massive hedge. I would guess they may have been originally tenants, eventually somehow buying the property. And that's interesting because how it was financed, I can't quite work out. You've got to remember that the Pratt family was quite poor, in fact very poor according to his book. So to come from being a tenant to owning this, although it had not much land, was quite an achievement. Richard's illness has become so bad he can no longer work. He's now confined to his bed and convinced he's going to die. And to be honest, his chances weren't good. Survival rates back in those days weren't very high. However, this was one young man who managed, against all the odds, to bounce back. And not literally bounce back, he wasn't made of rubber, but you get my drift. Against all odds, 6 months later, he'd started to recover. This he put down to his prayers to God. And he thought he could manage the half-mile or so walk to the local church, which, assuming he was living at Harlequin Lane, would have been on the Green All Saints. According to the book, he puts on his old soldier's greatcoat. How did he get this old soldier's coat? Charity shop? Unlikely. They weren't open yet. Could it have been a hand-me-down from his father? Quite commonplace in those days. Waste not, want not, bin it and forget it, like nowadays. The phrase put on his old army coat I found quite intriguing, because what army did it relate to? Where did he get it from? So let's just quickly look into that. In 1803, Napoleon threatened invasion of England, and it led to an Act of Parliament to identify those men who could be co-opted into a defence force. Lists were drawn up of all the men between the ages of 17 and 55. It is quite possible that Richard's dad could have been in the Dad's Army. No, not that Dad's Army, this Dad's Army. And that would explain where the old army greatcoat come from. With his old army greatcoat on, Richard walks to the nearest church, All Saints Chapel Green, founded in 1744 by Sir Henry Fermor of Walsh Manor. It seems to be a recurring theme in Richard Pratt's life, of extreme highs and feelings of enlightenment to that of extreme feelings of unworthiness and being damned by the devil. On his visit to church, he takes the Holy Sacrament, confirmation that he is committed to God. Unfortunately, only to be ridiculed on the way home by someone he knew, probably some young lads or whatever who don't particularly go to church. Again, he begins to question his faith and wonder whether he's done the right thing. As he returns home, he suffers a relapse, probably caused by having the mickey taken out of him for taking the sacrament. I get the impression from reading his book that Richard's father sees his son as both a blessing and a heavy weight to bear for the family. One of Richard's older brothers, I'm not sure what brother he's referring to in the book, as he's not named, but I assume it could have been Thomas, apparently had travelled to America. In those days, chances of seeing his brother again would have been very, very remote. But his father still had a second son, Richard, an invalid, who couldn't work, so he must have been quite a burden on the family resources. So how did he travel to America? Did he fly first class or by boat? They had no money, so who paid for this trip?
According to Wikipedia, many settlers from Europe arrived as indentured servants. They signed a contract to work and had their passage paid for in return for 5 to 7 years of work, including free room and board, clothing and training, but without cash wages. After their periods of indenture expired, many of the former servants founded small farms on the frontier. So you could understand his brother taking this opportunity of adventure and possibility of riches. Also, that his father would not have been happy to lose his son and the help he needed to work on the farm.
If the elder brother did return from America, it is possible that he come back with maybe some cash. The chapel in Lewes. Richard says that he would not listen to any other religion except Anglican. Well, we've had a bit of a road trip and we've just made our way down to Lewes, the ancient town of Lewes, famous for its street carnivals and things. I shouldn't say street carnival, I suppose it's...
bonfire night.
Bonfire night, thank you, Kev. Famous for its bonfire night. Well, we're not here on bonfire night, we're down here to have a look at this chapel. That's about it, really, Kev.
Okay. Yeah. Any significance to Richard?
He has. Richard never actually come, as far as I know, we never actually come down to Lewes to this chapel. So you're thinking, what are we doing here? But the founder of the chapel is connected to Lewes, is connected to Richard and to the Baptist connection of Rotherfield and eventually of Crowborough. So, it is actually a very strong connection, which I'll explain in the text in a minute. However, one day he and a friend couldn't resist listening to a gospel preacher, a Mr. Pitcher. He was preaching in Rotherfield, I assume in the old chapel before the new Providence Chapel was built. They only went there to make fun of the man after all. Mr. Pitcher from Hellingley was only a blacksmith who, after listening to sermons by William Huntington and Jenkinson of Jehiah Chapel in Lewes, decided to leave the Church of England and start preaching. I think it would be easy to dismiss the influence that these preachers were having at the time. According to the internet, Jehiah Chapel in Lewes had been built for Jenkinson, showing the growing popularity of the Baptist religion during this period. Treating the illness, homeopathic cures. He had given up with doctors as they had no cure for him, and relied on herbs and suggestions from friends to find some relief from his pain. So what did they try? Bleeding and purging. Some doctors, in a misguided attempt to remove the bad humours, prescribed bleeding and purging. So he was right in giving up with the doctors. And you would have to pay as well. No free NHS back in those days. Although his illness had affected both arms and one leg, by 1837, and now 21 years old, he's recovered enough to look for work. Yet again he finds work in a mill, but this time at a water mill. He says in Withyham. In his book he says that it's very near a church, and that is very important to him. but what church and what watermill? It could have been Sherlock's, as it's known, but the nearest church is quite a long walk. It could have been St John's Warren Mill, a well-known mill at the time and very busy, but I doubt this, as it didn't have a near church at the time. So here we are at St John's Church in the parish of Withyham. I know everybody thinks that it's in the parish of Crowborough, and it sort of is now, but back in the day this was an outpost of the parish of Withyham. I don't think that Richard Pratt went to this church because, as I've said before, he went to a church and worked at a mill that was very near. The nearest mill would have been the mill down the road there at St John. So we've already looked at Motts Mill, and we've concluded that doesn't have a church near to it. And we've now come to St John's, but the trouble with this church is it wasn't built until the year, what year, Kevin?
1876.
1876,
I think you said.
76, he thinks I said. We'll just double check that on the old phone. 1816, Kevin.
Wrong way round.
Doesn't matter. So the point is, this church wasn't around when Richard Pratt was looking for employment. So we need to find what mill and what church it was. So onward, Kevin. My guess would be Buckhurst Watermill. The emphasis that Richard puts on the fact that the church is so close to the mill and how important that it is to him makes it, in my opinion, the most likely candidate. You can practically touch the church from the mill. Well, not quite touch it, but it's not far. So we've come to the Buckhurst Park estate, and we're standing in front of the church on the estate.
Withyham Church.
Also known as Withyham Church. Thank you, Kevin. Very, very old church. When was it built, Kev?
Well, this has got a date on over the door of 1672, but they knew that something was here before 1400.
So it's a very old church. So this church would make sense because it's connected with the mill, which is just the other side. If you look over that way, over the brow of that hill, it then dips down. And then, as we'll see in a minute, we're going to have a look. That's where the old mill still sits, although it's no longer a mill, it's a private residence. So it's probably in distance, not even barely quarter of a mile, I would think, less than that. So Richard could have easily worked and lived down by the mill, and he could have come up to his beloved church and did with his religious practices as he wished to do so. As we're at Withyham Church, I think we'll take the opportunity to have a very quick walk round and just have a look at this beautiful old building. So the first thing you're struck by as you come into the church are these wonderful old, what seem to be old pictures hanging on the wall. But I've been told that they're actually photographic reproductions of the originals, because the originals were worth a lot of money and they eventually were sold in order to finance the roof on the building, which does make sense. So just walking around, you've got wonderful stained glass panels, absolutely beautiful woodwork, stone craftsmanship of the pillars and the arches, absolutely stunning. And our person, Richard Pratt, who we're following his life story through, wasn't the only famous person to actually visit this church, apparently. And we know this because that person left his picture up on the window, St. Nicholas. So it looks like Father Christmas visited Withyham at some point. Isn't that just wonderful? So we've walked from Buckhurst Park Church, and not very far, as I said before, we've now walked round the park a little bit, just over the brow of the hill, and now we're trying to find the Buckhurst watermill. Now, as you can see, this is a really idyllic place. You've got these wonderful mill ponds stretching across. We've just seen a whole flock of deer across there, back on the
That'll be a herd then, will it?
yeah, that'll do. Yeah, thanks, Kev. It's a herd of deer or a flock of deer. All make mistakes. Anyway, we're not sure quite which one is the mill building, but we've got two beautifully old buildings here. Both the brickwork to me looks very old. I would think they're probably handmade bricks, locally made, I would say, looking at the size of, particularly on this first building. They're smaller than a traditional brick like Crowborough stocks or Ibstocks or West Oakleys. They look a bit smaller to me, which normally indicates that they are made locally on site somewhere or not very far away. Tile hang, again, very traditional looking, with a cat slide at the back, lovely building. Then looking over to the left hand side on the other side, I can't quite make out the name of the house, but I think it's Mill something, so we don't want to be intrusive on anyone's private house, but I got a feeling that that probably was the mill house over there, or certainly in connection with it. Now, the point is, these buildings, this area, we know was the Buckhurst Mill. We know that the church was literally just through those trees over yonder. So, to my mind, this is where Richard got his employment at that point. Unfortunately, Richard's health soon deteriorated. He blames this on his waning faith and wanting to go and have some fun with people over the Christmas period. God then strikes him down with his bad leg again. So, after only a month or so, he has to leave his place of employment and return to his father's farm. You get the impression that his feelings of guilt of being a burden again weighs heavily on his shoulders. I expect his father added to his feelings of guilt as well. Again, after some time, with some slight recovery, he's able to cut some wood and do some light work. It was about this time that he heard about a doctor in Tunbridge Wells, and he may have a cure or at least be able to alleviate his pain. Dr. Charles Trewstrom was a well-respected doctor, born 1809 at Shillington in Bedfordshire. Apprenticed in Bedfordshire, then in 1829 working at St Thomas's and Guy's Hospitals in London. In 1832 he commenced his practice in Tunbridge Wells, continuing for 40 years until his death, also in Tunbridge Wells. Regarded as a very skillful surgeon and often giving his services to the poor at no cost. Well, we ventured our way into the Royal Tunbridge Wells in the county of Kent, so we've come out of our normal comfort zone of Crowborough, Rotherfield and round that area, and we've come to this very well-known pond just on the way into Tunbridge Wells. And this is the pond which was known as Trewsom's Pond, named after Dr. Charles Trewsom, the physician from the Royal Tunbridge Wells Hospital. Anyway, and as we can see from the state of the water, I certainly wouldn't drink any, which is ironic really, because it was built in his name, and because he was involved in introducing clean drinking water to Tunbridge Wells. So that's the idea of the pond. But as I say, it's ironic because I certainly wouldn't be drinking that. Although the fish are probably okay, and then the ducks look okay as well. So there we are. That's our visit to Tunbridge Wells. Unfortunately, rather than getting better, Richard found no recovery from the good doctor. In fact, he was quickly getting worse. Although he wasn't a well man, at first he would walk the 7 miles to Tunbridge Wells from Crowborough. Yes, he was an ill man, and yet he would still walk to Tunbridge Wells. But as he deteriorated, he had to go, as he calls it, by carrier. His options would have been some sort of stagecoach or a mail coach, but most likely he would pay a local tradesman to ride with him on his cart, this being the cheapest option. The emergence of railways in the 1830s had not yet reached Tunbridge Wells, not until the 3rd of August 1868, so no trains yet. Anyway, it was not long before the ride became too intolerable for him to bear, remaining at home and only just being able to cross the room on crutches. No more doctoring for Richard. After a spell of convalescing, Richard was thrashing in a barn. I assume this is using a thrashing machine. So I looked on Wikipedia to see what this would have involved. The swing riots in the UK were partly a result of the thrashing machine. Following years of war, high taxes and low wages, farm labourers finally revolted in 1830. They had faced unemployment for years due to the widespread introduction of these threshing machines and the policy of enclosing the fields. No longer were there thousands of men needed to tend the crops, only a few would suffice. With fewer jobs, lower wages and no prospects, the thrashing machine was their final straw. It would place them on the brink of starvation. The swing rioters smashed thrashing machines and threatened farmers who had them. The riots were dealt with very harshly. 9 of the rioters were hanged and a further 450 were transported to Australia. Although he doesn't say in his book that he used a thrashing machine, we can only assume that he did. With his frail health, he would not have been able to thrash wheat or corn manually. During the following spring, and feeling much better, we find Richard doing some work. It's around this time that Richard shows his compassion and charity. Whilst working in the barn, a poor old man enters. The man was poorly dressed. He spoke to Richard of God and of the Lord in such a way of faith that Richard felt so drawn to him that he wanted to give him something. But what? He had no money or food to give. He took off his jacket, took it off his back, and in an instant just gave it to the man. He is paid a visit by Dr. Robert Grimm. Robert Grimm was a high churchman, a domestic chaplain to the Lord Abergavenny, and was known to support the tracts. Those who supported tracts were known as tracticians and asserted the doctrinal authority of the Catholic Church to be absolute. And by Catholic they understood that which was faithful to the teaching of the early and undivided Church. They believed the Church of England to be such an absolute, and by Catholic they understood that which was faithful to the teaching of the early and undivided Church. They believed the Church of England to be such a Catholic Church. A visit from such a well-respected clergyman and his advice would have been acted on, and so it was. He suggests that Richard should attend Brighton Hospital, as they apparently had a reputation of many cures and was sure that he could alleviate his affliction. With paper of admittance kindly given by Dr. Grimm, he journeys to Brighton. Shame he didn't have a bus pass. It must have cost a few bob to get there way back then, and would have took a long time as well. The journey must have been quite some undertaking, probably by coach due to the distance. His book indicates that he did not stay very long at the hospital. In fact, he rapidly deteriorates, so much so he returns home worse than he left off. It may be the case that he suffered from homesickness. After all, Brighton would have been like a foreign country to him back in the day. After again improving in his health, Richard is then seized with influenza. Again confined to his room, he has yet another doctor visit him. Dr. Holman was from Mayfield. He is instructed to only Dr. Richard for his influenza, not his King's disease, as he wished to continue with his own homeopathic methods, and had probably lost all faith in doctors in that regard. On October the 11th, 1838, he's able to seek further employment, so he goes to the Stone Mill at Rotherfield, Dewlands Hill. He doesn't actually mention that it's his grandmother's mill, but anyway, this mill has ancient origins and still exists today, but no longer a working mill, but a listed building of interest and a lovely private home. Resting on the stream's edge at the bottom of Dewlands Hill, it sits in a somewhat idyllic and romantic position. The mill was run by John Ashby Jr. until 1824, when he left the mill to his wife Kitty, Richard Pratt maternal grandmother. She must have been quite a formidable woman, as she continued to run the mill until 1856 at the age of 88. Having secured a job at the mill, and it seems half-heartedly attending church, he becomes friendly with the local mill loader. From his account, the lad seems to be lively, cheerful. They enjoyed life and having a good time together. At Christmas 1838, he thinks it was a Monday in his book, but actually the 25th of December 1838 was a Tuesday, but that's by the by. Now influenced by the mischief of his work colleague, Richard intends to go to a dance in Crowborough, we assume at the Crowborough Cross pub as it was, and meet up with some other young folk. Bit of dance and a bit of fun. And just before this, he visits his brother in Crowborough for tea. Shortly after taking tea, he's struck with a pain in his leg again. So bad he cannot return to his grandmother's mill and has to stay at his father's house in Harlequin Lane, spending the Christmas day miserable, blaming it on his thoughts of sinning, as he says he surely would have sinned, and blaming this all on his affliction, and thanking God for stopping him for sinning. He rests for a few days.